Hi, witches. I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. As we all soak in the final days of summer, some of us are feeling the wear of the restless heat and bright sun, while others are seizing every opportunity for one last outdoor adventure. But as we enjoy the dog days of summer, please remember, we aren't the only ones out there. Troublemakers and evil entities are also lurking, eager to have their fill before summer's end. First, whatever you do, don't let them in, followed by the blinding light of death. Finally, in our featured story, Scars of Blood and Guilt. Before we get to our stories, I wanted to ask for your support. As you likely know, the media world has been in transition, and the shifting sands of monetization have made it difficult for podcasts to make money. Although I realize you hear a lot of ads when you listen, the value of each individual ad has fallen, so much so that we are now running more ads and making less money. To help us continue to produce the weekly podcast and video, we were asking fans to join our Patreon as a paid subscriber. It's only $5 a month. That's just over $1 per episode, and it's one of the ways you can help Something Scary continue to grow. Go to patreon.com/snarled and join us today. Thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful for the support of all of our listeners. So, want to hear something scary? Dead Days of Summer. They say that if you seek, you shall find, so beware of the consequences when conjuring something terrible, like in this story inspired by Brooke S. Lydia had spent the summer bouncing around from summer camp to summer camp. She was finally on the bus headed to her last one, a week-long sleepaway camp. She sat on the bus reading paranormal stories, which she had a huge fascination with. She even wore an amulet around her neck. She bought it off eBay for the chance it would warn off evil spirits. So when the short, red-haired girl she just met started telling her a freaky story, Lydia knew exactly what creatures she was talking about. The girl spoke in a hollow, tremulous voice. "Have you heard the stories about the camp we're going to?" the girl asked. "No," Lydia exclaimed, fear and excitement evident on her face. As her new acquaintance began talking, Lydia thought this could be her chance to get real proof of the supernatural. The girl told a story about her older cousin, Julia, who claimed something terrifying happened at this camp. Lydia's heart raced as she listened. It started with a hard knock on the door. The girl began. Julia and her friend Sherry were the only ones to get up because they were in the bunks closest to the door. It was around 3 a.m. Julia looked down from the top bunk and saw Sherry's startled face. The cabin felt unnaturally cold. Lydia leaned in, completely engrossed. Despite feeling it was a bit cliche for a scary story to take place at a summer camp, she was entirely captivated by the tale. Sherry opened the door and jumped back in fear. The girl continued. There were 2 kids, one about 11 years old and the other around 6 or 7. This camp is only for teens, so it was strange. They were standing just outside the light from the porch, their faces obscured by the dark. The older boy asked to come in, but Julia said they weren't supposed to let anyone in and offered to call someone instead. The younger boy said no. Another girl on the bus, Shonda, interrupted. She wanted to hear the scary story too. The red-haired girl continued, smiling at Lydia. Their clothes were outdated and dirty. When they stepped into the light, their eyes were completely black. Julia and Sherry slammed the door and woke the other girls. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, terrified. Lydia felt exhilarated. That sounds like the black-eyed children. She began explaining the legend to the others. People think they might be aliens, vampires, or even demons. The 3 girls decided to try and see these black-eyed children themselves. They planned to meet outside their respective cabins at 3 a.m. and spend at least one night exploring the woods after everyone else fell asleep. By the time the bus arrived at the camp, Shonda had read several accounts of these creatures on her phone, adding to their anticipation. Once at camp, despite their exhaustion, Lydia insisted on their plan. They set alarms for 3 a.m. and went to bed early. Lydia's excitement kept her awake longer than usual, her mind racing with anticipation, hoping the other girls wouldn't chicken out and would meet up at their chosen spot. The sharp vibration of her alarm woke her abruptly. She quickly dressed and slipped out of her cabin, meeting Shonda and the red-haired girl outside. They ventured out into the woods, the grass wet with morning dew. The clear sky and bright stars only added to Lydia's joy. But as they reached the tree line, the darkness seemed impenetrable. Lydia took a deep breath and led the way. They suddenly stopped at the sound of something running. With Shonda's flashlight, they saw it was just a deer. Relieved, they continued. But soon they heard a whispering sound, almost like voices. But they couldn't make out any words. Their flashlights began flickering and then went out one by one, sending them into darkness. They grabbed each other's arms and tried to make their way back to the camp, but the woods seemed endless. They stumbled and fell. Lydia felt a sharp pain in her knee, but urged them to keep going. They heard whispering voices again and the sound of footsteps around them. Suddenly, they saw a young boy standing in front of them with a smug look. As he reached out toward Lydia, she felt a rush of fear and a sensation like being punched in the stomach. Then he was gone. Frantic, the three split, all running back to camp separately. When Lydia finally reached her cabin, she quickly ran inside, locking the door behind her. Lydia's cabin mates woke up and gathered around, asking what had happened. Lydia shared her story, explaining the strange occurrences and the black-eyed boy they had seen in the woods. Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. The room fell silent. Lydia's eyes widened in horror. "Don't open it," she whispered. The knocking continued, growing more incessant. The girls huddled together, their fear palpable. Then they heard, "It's me, open up." Lydia peeked out and saw Shonda and the red-haired girl looking terrified. She swung open the door and pulled them in, locking it again behind them. When Lydia turned around, she felt a strange sense of unease. They all sat together, fear and uncertainty hanging heavily in the air. Lydia tried to explain the legend of the black-eyed children to her cabin mates, who listened in terror. As the hours dragged on, Lydia noticed something strange about the red-haired girl. She seemed unusually calm and detached from the panic around them. When Lydia confronted her, the girl's eyes suddenly turned pitch black. "Thank you for letting me in," she said with a chilling smile. Lydia and the other girls screamed, realizing the red-haired girl had been one of them all along. The room grew colder, and the air felt heavy with dread. Her presence became more menacing, and Lydia knew they had to do something before it was too late. Remembering something she had read in her research, she grabbed a flashlight and shone it directly at the red-haired girl's face. The light flickered, the girl recoiled, hissing like an animal. The other girls followed suit, using whatever light sources they had. As the flashlight beams lit up the red-haired girl, she recoiled and hissed, her black eyes glistening. Lydia and the others fought to keep her at bay with their lights. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a gust of wind swept through the cabin, and another child, an older one with black eyes, stood in the doorway. "Let her in," he said coldly. "She belongs to us now." The red-haired girl advanced with a chilling, deliberate calm. Lydia, clutching her flashlight, felt a surge of desperation. She grabbed a silver amulet from around her neck, hoping it might have some power. The girl's grin faltered as she focused on the amulet. "You can't appease them," the red-haired girl said. "They take what they want." The room spun, whispers converging into a cacophony. The boy moved forward, his presence suffocating. In a final, desperate act, Lydia threw the necklace into the darkness. The girl lunged at her, her form twisting into a nightmarish shape. The last thing Lydia saw was the boy's empty eyes before darkness consumed her. A bone-chilling scream echoed through the night. By dawn, the cabin was found empty, the door ajar. The room was freezing cold. The only trace left was the tarnished silver amulet lying on the floor, useless. The camp became notorious for its inexplicable disappearances, adding a new layer to the legend of the black-eyed children, who were said to come knocking and never leave. Have you ever stayed at a haunted location? What type of paranormal entities did you expect to find? Were you successful? Tell us about your haunted adventures by emailing us at somethingscary@snarled.com. Sometimes we gathered the courage to face our fears, only to discover we were right to be terrified in the first place, like in this story written by Sara. Mariella had spent the last decade within the confines of her old, decaying house, the heavy curtains drawn tightly over every window, blocking out even the faintest sliver of daylight. At 52 years old, she was a prisoner in her own home. Trapped by her own fears, living in perpetual darkness of her lonely home, the outside world, once a source of joy and exploration, had become a realm of unspeakable terror. Her sister Sophia and nephew Danny were her lifeline to the world outside. Sophia knew that mental illness had taken their grandmother, so she attributed it running in the family as the cause of her sister's troubling behavior. Sophie and Danny visited regularly, bringing Mariella food, supplies, and news of the world beyond her self-imposed prison. Danny, now a 17-year-old soccer prodigy, was the light of Mariella's life. His visits, filled with tales of his exploits on the field and his dreams of glory, were the highlights of her otherwise monotonous existence. She lived vicariously through him, hearing tales of parties with his friends and the goings-on at school. But as he got older and busier, the visits became less frequent. As much as it broke Mariella's heart, she understood. When Sophia's car pulled up to the house one day, Mariella had hopes of seeing Danny, but much to her disappointment, only Sophia emerged with groceries. Once settled inside, Mariella was given the exciting update. Danny's team had made it to the championships. Sophia's voice was filled with pride and excitement. She told her sister that Danny would love it if she could go and watch him play. Mariella's heart ached. She adored Danny and wanted nothing more than to support him. But the thought of stepping outside was paralyzing. "You know I can't, Sophia. The light, it's waiting for me out there. It wants to kill me." "Don't," Sophia said, exasperated, a mixture of pity and frustration in her eyes. "There's no light entity, Mariella. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. Please, for Danny's sake, try to come. It would mean the world to him." Mariella's resolve wavered. Danny had done so much for her, always understanding, never pushing too hard. Could she really let him down now? The night before the big game, she made a decision. For Danny, she would face her fears. The day of the championship dawned blisteringly hot, the temperature soaring to 96 degrees with a heat advisory. Mariella stood at her front door trembling. She hadn't been outside in over a decade. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped into the searing heat. The sunlight was blinding, and for a moment, she felt a surge of panic. But then she thought of Danny's smiling face, his eyes filled with hope and encouragement. Her heart swelled with love and determination. She could do this, for him. The game was a blur of heat and noise. Danny was spectacular, darting across the field with skill and agility. For the first time in years, Mariella felt something other than fear. She felt proud and alive. After the game, Danny and Sophia embraced her, their faces glowing with pride and relief. Sophia pointed out with joy and care that she was alive. She was fine. There was nothing to worry about, nothing scary in the outside world. Mariella smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, She could breathe easy. Maybe she had been wrong all these years. Maybe the entity didn't exist. An imaginary demon concocted by her own sick and twisted imagination. Perhaps her mind created that fear as some sort of excuse for her not to participate in life when things become too overwhelming. Feeling a newfound sense of freedom, Mariella got into her car, ready to drive home. As she locked the door, a sudden overwhelming terror gripped her. The air grew heavy, and a sense of weight filled the car. It was there, the entity. At first, she tried to convince herself it was all in her head. She repeated, "I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine," over and over again, until she could no longer ignore the presence of something terrible breathing in her ear. Frantically, she tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Turning toward the passenger seat, she saw it. A dark, formless presence, its eyes glowing with blinding light, brighter than the sun. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please let me go." A deep, resonant voice filled the car. "You should have stayed inside." Later that night, Mariella was found dead in her car. The coroner ruled it a case of heat stroke, exacerbated by her age and the intense heat. But Danny knew better. He had always believed in Mariella's stories, and now he was certain the entity was real. In the weeks that followed, Danny became increasingly withdrawn. He was devastated by the loss of his aunt and couldn't help but feel somewhat responsible. The world outside, once a playground of dreams and aspirations, now seemed filled with unseen dangers. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of his stomach. One evening, he sat in Mariella's old house, now his, as it was left to him in her will. He felt a familiar chill in the air. The heavy curtains were drawn, just as she had always kept them. He stared at the door, the barrier between him and the evil that took his aunt. "You were right, Aunt Mariella," he whispered to the empty room. "It's safer inside." From that day on, Danny rarely left the house. He believed that whatever this entity was that plagued his family, he was just the next in line. Despite his mother's desperate pleas, his life seemed to crumble before her eyes. He lost his soccer scholarship to college, and he didn't end up going at all. Connections with friends died off one by one, and Danny before a shell of his former gregarious self. The championships and the accolades meant nothing to him anymore. All that mattered was staying safe, away from the light, away from the entity. For him, just as it had been for Mariella, the world outside had become a place of unspeakable terror, and within the shadows of his home, he felt a sense of security, knowing that the entity could never get him as long as he stayed inside. The evil that had clearly cursed his family would now die with him. At least, that was his hope. Have you ever thought something was true about your family, then realized it was all a lie? Have anything supernatural ever plagued you or a loved one? Friends will come and go, but for better or worse, your family is stuck with you forever. Like in this story, written by Sara. Ollie's fist clenched as the family van bounced along the rough forest road. His father had insisted on this bonding camping trip out in Douglas, Wyoming, determined to make their blended family a harmonious unit. But Ollie didn't want harmony. He wanted his life back, the one that existed before his mom left and his dad remarried. Emery, his stepsister, sat in the back seat next to him, humming cheerfully. She was younger by 2 years, and her incessant positivity grated on Ollie's nerves. His stepmother, Brenda, turned around from the passenger seat, flashing a too bright smile. "We're almost there. Isn't this exciting, Ollie?" Ollie grunted in response, his thoughts elsewhere. Just down the way, on the other side of the campground, his best friends were celebrating a birthday. He could have been there, laughing and having fun, but instead, he was stuck with people he didn't even want to call family. As they set up camp, Ollie's resentment grew. His dad, trying too hard to make everything perfect, and Brenda always chirping about making memories. Emery, meanwhile, seemed to think this was the best adventure ever. It made Ollie's skin crawl. Night fell, and after a forced and awkward campfire sing-along, they all retreated to their tents. Ollie lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. He couldn't stop thinking about his friends, probably having a blast without him. Then he heard it. A rustling outside the tent, muffled voices, laughter. His friends! They must have snuck over to see him. Heart pounding with excitement, Ollie quietly unzipped his tent and slipped out. The forest was darker than he expected. He was guided only by little glimpses of moonlight between branches. A thick mist wove through the underbrush, wrapping around the trunks like ghosts. He moved cautiously towards the sound of his friends' voices, but as he got closer, he somehow felt even further away. He noticed the laughter had a strange quality, almost metallic, echoing unnaturally through the trees. Ollie paused to take in his surroundings. The laughter had a hollow, tinny sound, like it was being played through a broken speaker. Despite his instincts telling him to turn around, his curiosity got the better of him. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the mist grew thicker. Every snap of a twig underfoot echoed loudly in the stillness. He came to a small clearing and stopped short. There, lit up by the moon, was not his group of friends, but a creature he had only heard about in stories around campfires. A jackalope. It looked like a jackrabbit with a set of antlers on its ears, but as Ollie watched in horror, he noticed the creature's large, canine teeth and sharp incisors. The jackalope's eyes glowed a bright and piercing red. Ollie's breath caught in his throat as the creature turned its head, fixing its death gaze on him. He tried to back away, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The jackalope moved with an unsettling grace, its eyes never leaving Ollie's. Then, in exact mimicry, the jackalope began to speak, its voice a warped version of his friend's laughter and voice. Ollie's blood ran cold. This was no friendly visit. This was a predator, and he was its prey. As the creature drew nearer, Ollie noticed the forest around him seemed to come alive with ear-piercing sounds of branches blowing in harsh winds and animals disturbed. Trees creaked as if unseen hands were bending them, and creatures seemed to move in the corners of his vision, forming shapes that seemed almost human before dissolving back into darkness. Just as the jackalope crouched, ready to pounce, a scream pierced through all the noise. Emery burst into the clearing, wielding a fallen branch. She swung it with all her might, striking the jackalope and momentarily stunning it. She cried for Ollie to run. Snapping out of his trance, he turned and fled, but not before he saw the jackalope lunge at Emery. He heard her cries of pain, mingled with the snarls of the beast, as he tore through the forest, desperate to find help. By the time he returned with his father and a flashlight, the jackalope was gone. They found Emery lying on the ground, her clothes torn, blood soaking into the earth. She was alive, but horribly maimed, her once cheerful face twisted in pain. The rest of the night was a blur of emergency calls and desperate measures to keep Emery stable. As dawn broke, Ollie sat by her side, guilt gnawing at him. She had saved his life, and he hadn't been able to save her from the monstrous jackalope. Their camping trip was cut short, but the bonds formed that night were stronger than any forced family activity could have created. As Emery recovered slowly but surely, Ollie stayed by her side, vowing to protect her as she had protected him. The memory of the jackalope haunted his dreams, glowing red eyes a constant reminder of the night they had fought for their lives. And in the darkness, when the forest was quiet, Ollie swore he could still hear the mocking laughter echoing through the trees. Have you ever had someone step up to help you? Someone you least expected? How did it change your bond forever? This week's podcast stories were edited by Sara Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris. Additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman. Produced by Ana Villalobos. Executive produced by Gail Gilman. Music by Sapphire Sindalo and Calvin Linderman.